It makes me sad to think that this will probably be the last first birthday cake I make for our kids. Unfortunately, I didn't document the process of the first one I made for our son 2 years ago, but I hope my kids will eventually watch this video and see the thought, love, and care I put into this seemingly simple looking cake. Happy birthday, little one. Full disclosure, I am not a baker, but I'm willing to try figuring things out using my experience in the kitchen and a little creativity. Trigger alert. As beautiful as a lot of the first birthday cakes are out there, I'm personally not a fan of the ones wrapped completely in fondant. It's something I just don't enjoy eating myself or want to give to my kids to put in their bodies if there are alternatives. They're also kind of expensive and wasteful, as most of it goes into the trash from what I see. Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. As an alternative to fondant or cream, butter, sugar-based frostings, I separated out the whey from the casein protein curds of 2 cups of vanilla yogurt through some paper towel and a strainer. There are a few reasons to do this. 1, so the cake won't be too soggy and fall apart as I'm assembling it. 2, this will also strain out most of the organic cane sugar that's dissolved in the whey, while leaving the frosting slightly tart and sweet with a bit of that vanilla fragrance. 3, the frosting itself would be thick enough to hold the cake together better structurally. Ideally, I would be making my own yogurt for this, but I got lazy. This is a reminder for myself on why I hate measuring cups. Naturally, oats are gluten-free, but you still need to be careful when you're purchasing oats or oatmeal, as there can be cross-contamination in the field or during the milling process. So if you suspect that you may be gluten intolerant or may have celiac disease, look for the green symbol before you purchase. Or any of these other logos, you should be looking for the warning in small print, may contain wheat. Here I just made my own oat flour using rolled oats by 1 degree with my high-speed blender. It also happens to be organic, non-GMO, that's both glyphosate and non-glyphosate free, as well as certified vegan and kosher. The oat flour will heat up, so I let it sit in a cool glass container for a bit before covering it. Oat flour can be used to replace wheat flour in a lot of recipes. Bob's Red Mill website suggests adding xanthan gum whenever you bake with oat flour, but I didn't have any xanthan gum lying around, nor did I want to put that in the cake either. It supposedly helps the cake bind itself better, so it doesn't crumble as much. But for a smash cake, I want her to bash the hell out of it, so I don't think I'll be needing any xanthan gum. Thank you very much, Bob. Here I'm grating a medium-sized carrot and squeezed as much water out of it, so the grated carrot won't all sink to the bottom of the cake. My daughter loves carrots to the point where I think I gave her CAROTENEMIA. This is why she looked like an Oompa Loompa for the first half of her life. This usually results from excess consumption of beta-carotene-rich foods. Thankfully, looking like an Oompa Loompa is probably the only bad thing about having too much of this. Hot tip: even green foods such as dark leafy greens, broccoli, and peas contain high amounts of beta-carotene. We went through a period where we minimized the consumption of high beta-carotene-rich foods so that she would look a little bit more human. Beta-carotene is a fat-soluble vitamin and antioxidant that gets converted into vitamin A through the liver and supposedly helps with vision and overall eye health, the immune system, as well as the skin. Pro tip: while my hands were already orange anyway, I shredded some extra carrots for pickling that I can use as a condiment or a side dish, or to simply throw into a salad for another meal at a later time. Arguably the least healthy aspect of this cake, raisins, believe it or not, are just straight sugar, with a glycemic index of 66, the same as refined sugar. So I'm not going to go nuts with this. Ideally, I would have used dates instead, which has a lower glycemic index of 42, but I didn't have any on hand, so this was the closest thing. Thankfully, despite the glycemic index being high, you can alter the glycemic load simply by adjusting the portion size, which is probably a better tool to use for managing blood sugars anyway. I wanted to give this cake just a little bit more heterogeneity for sweetness and texture, hopefully to make each bite just a little bit more interesting than just a bland oat cake. Here I have 2 4-inch springform pans with 2 pre-cut circles of parchment paper to line the bottom, and I coated it lightly with olive oil and oat flour that I made to prevent the cake from sticking. I did this by rubbing the oil with my fingers and using a paper towel to remove the excess. This is probably one of the most important steps for this cake, given that I'm not using wheat flour, as the cake can easily crumble once I unlatch the springform pan. Here I measured out 1.5 cups of oat flour first. You'll see later that I ended up adding an extra 1/4 cup of flour because the batter became too wet after I added the maple syrup and applesauce. This is most likely because the density of oat flour is actually less than all-purpose wheat flour. And I'm also kind of making up this recipe from scratch too, so I just have to use my senses and improvise if things don't look like they're going in the right direction. I wanted a batter that was just a little bit thicker than pancake batter. I always crack my eggs on a hard surface rather than a sharp surface, like the edge of a bowl, to prevent small shards of eggshells from entering the egg mixture. It's not the end of the world if it does, but if I can avoid it, why not? Alright, a little bit of egg and chiffon cake sides. The great thing about chiffon cakes is that it leavens out the cake naturally without using chemicals like baking powder or baking soda. Because there's no gluten in the oat flour to hold the cake together structurally, I'm almost purely and literally putting all my eggs in this basket and relying on these extra large eggs to hold my cake together. So please don't fail me, chicken babies. And because I'm a nerd, I'm going to tell you that the egg whites are about 90% water and about 10% protein, mostly in the form of OVALBUMIN. Proteins are these strands of amino acids that are either hydrophilic, loves water, or hydrophobic, scared of water. And egg proteins actually possess both hydrophilic and hydrophobic properties. When beating eggs, you're doing a few things. One is by dragging the whisk through the egg, you're actually mechanically denaturing or unfolding the coiled up protein. Two, you're incorporating air bubbles into this protein water solution. Three, normally, the hydrophilic parts of the protein are on the outside of these coiled up proteins, and the hydrophobic parts are tucked in the center. By whisking and unraveling these proteins while incorporating air bubbles, you restructure the protein solution to have the hydrophobic parts to be in contact with air pockets, and the hydrophilic parts to be connected to other spheres. This is the reason why the bowl for which you're whisking your egg whites should never have any grease in it, because the hydrophobic parts of the protein will want to bind to the grease and you'll just be wasting your time in your eggs. And when you then heat or cook the egg foam, the air bubbles will expand while the protein network will harden, and done properly, it'll create a magically fluffy cake or meringue. You can do this with aquafaba, which is essentially the water left over from cooked chickpeas or canned chickpeas, if you want a hipster vegan egg substitute. For a chiffon cake, the general steps are put all the wet ingredients together, then the dry, then fold in the egg whites. So here I'm adding 1/8 of a cup of olive oil so the cake doesn't dry out. I deliberately chose not to use extra virgin olive oil because I don't actually want it to taste like olive oil. 1/4 cup of maple syrup to remind her that she's Canadian. 1/2 cup of applesauce that I made previously. And make sure everything's all nicely incorporated before I put in the dry ingredients. So for the dry ingredients, I mixed in 1/2 teaspoon of ground ginger and a full teaspoon of ground cinnamon to get her familiar with some spices and to develop her taste buds. Stir that in nicely. Since after she was about 6 months, I've been incorporating various herbs and spices into her food in small quantities to flavor her food rather than seasoning with salt. Here I'm adding the extra 1/4 cup of oat flour that I talked about because the batter was too wet. Here I'm adding a portion, roughly about 1/3 of the egg whites, into the batter so the rest of the egg whites later can incorporate a little bit more easily. I call this the sacrifice. This is the remaining 2/3 of the egg whites that I will fold in gently. And as I was folding, I realized that I forgot to put in some of my other wet-ish ingredients, such as the carrots and the raisins, which I am going to try to fold in carefully. Accidents happen all the time. Own it, adapt, and move on. Fold, fold, fold. And we done. And a quick preliminary taste test, not too sweet, just enough cinnamon that's not overpowering, no olive oil taste, not oily, so I think we're good to go. Ladle the cake batter into the pans until they're about 2/3 full. I'm going to bake 2 first because I only have 2 cake pans. Put them on a tray with a ramekin of hot water as an attempt to keep the cakes from cracking. And I'm not sure exactly how long to bake it for, but I'm thinking it'll probably be about 10 to 15 minutes. After about 15 minutes, it looks like the cakes are done. And a toothpick check to make sure the center of the cake is well cooked, ensuring that there's no batter left on this toothpick when I pull it out. As you can see, the top of the cakes are cracked, but it doesn't really matter because I wouldn't be covering it with frosting anyway. Then I carefully use a paring knife to release the edge of the cake from the cake pan, so when I open the spring, the whole thing won't fall apart, while trying not to burn my fingers at the same time. And the moment of truth. Bam! I think we're in good shape. Careful, careful. And it looks like a fat cookie. I'll be stacking 3 of these for the cake. And then gingerly place these cakes onto some cooling racks. And then set up again for the remaining of the batter. As you can probably tell, I got lazy and did not cut the parchment paper like I did for the first 2 cakes. It was around 4 in the morning when I was doing this, so I decided to use that time to make coffee instead. Ladle in the rest of the batter like we did for the first 2 cakes. Drop in some batter into your water bath like a slob. You saw nothing. And bake for another 15 minutes. With some movie magic, we have a few more cakes. Okay, back to the frosting. After about a day of straining, this is all the way that I was able to pull from the yogurt that would have otherwise caused this cake to probably fall apart. And now the fun part. Remember to pull off any parchment paper that's left on this cake. I don't have one of those fancy cake spinning things, so I just use a plate and put some yogurt at the bottom to keep the first layer in place. Smear on some more frosting so the next layer will stick. Spread, spread, spread. Stack on your next layer. Repeat. Do the same with your last layer. Realize that the cake is a little bit too wobbly, so you take a wooden skewer and you stab the cake right in the middle. And then continue frosting. Guaranteed this process will be messy. Here's my sad attempt to do some final touches on the frosting. So rather than using sprinkles, I decided to crumble the last piece of cake into small pieces that I toasted and then used as decoration. And as I was waiting for those pieces to toast, I decided to give this cake a try, and it's pretty darn good. I figured the cake could use a bit of texture as well. I used the back of a wooden spoon to break down any large pieces, and then make it rain. Well, not quite, because you kind of have to do this carefully. Filling in any sort of imperfections. I transitioned to a spoon to make it a little bit easier for myself, and that I could actually scoop up any excess crumbs from the bottom. And a deep sigh when you realize that this is taking much longer than you expect it to. Take a clean paper towel to push all the crumbs towards the cake and to wipe off any excess crumbs. And voila, we are done. Remove the funny looking candle and replace it with a real one. And there we have it. My daughter's very first birthday cake that I practically made from scratch, that didn't use things like baking soda, baking powder, coloring agents, added sugar, which also happens to be gluten-free. I cut a slice out of the cake so you can take a look at the inside. You can see that there isn't quite as much separation between the layers as desired, but that's okay, no biggie.
Happy birthday to you. Yay! Okay, 3, 2, 1. Go!
Okay.
Go. Want to eat?
She doesn't know what to do with it.
Hello.
怕唔怕？
Yeah.
Okay, go!
攞嚟食啊！
Wow. She's so gentle.
Destroy it, like your toys.
都幾好食喎。唔係你食先，我食先。
係啦
Break it.
，come on。你幫媽媽攞，你幫媽媽攞蛋糕好冇？哦，係啊，食啦。驚啊！
She's scared.
唔使驚，唔使驚，你攞俾媽咪食
佢客氣啦。
你攞俾媽媽食啊？係喎，哇！哇！
俾媽媽食啊！
俾媽媽食啊！
一陣啦，
More.
一陣要抹過。
I don't think she's.
We tried. We tried.
你好斯文啊！你好斯文。俾媽媽揞啊 I think that's it then.
You like it? Yeah, yummy? Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.